Let the king live. Escorted by valiant men, Saul returned to Gibeah. Though good-for-nothing men spoke disparagingly of him and despised him, Saul remained silent. 1 Samuel 17-27. Early victories. About a month later, according to the reading of the Greek Septuagint and Dead Sea Scroll, folk summer in 1 Samuel 11. One Ammonite king Nahash demanded the surrender of Jabesh in Gilead. See Nahash number 1. When messengers brought news of this to Saul, God's Spirit became operative upon him. He quickly rallied an army of 330,000 men and led it to victory. This resulted in a strengthening of Saul's position as king, the people even requesting that those who had spoken against him be put to death. But Saul, appreciating that Jehovah had granted the victory, did not consent to this. Subsequently, at Gilgal, Saul's kingship was confirmed anew. 1 Samuel 11. 1-15. Next, Saul undertook steps to break the power of the Philistines over Israel. He chose 3,000 Israelites, placing 2,000 under himself and the remainder under his son Jonathan. Evidently acting at his father's direction, Jonathan struck down the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. In retaliation, the Philistines assembled a mighty force and began camping at Michmash. 1 Samuel 13. 3-5. Sins presumptuously. Meanwhile, Saul had withdrawn from Michmash to Gilgal in the Jordan Valley. There he waited 7 days for Samuel. But Samuel did not come at the appointed time. Fearing that the enemy would sweep down upon him when he had not secured Jehovah's help and that further delay would result in losing his army, Saul compelled himself to offer up the burnt sacrifice. Samuel, on arriving, condemned Saul's foolish act as sinful. Evidently, Saul's sin consisted of his presumptuously going ahead with the sacrifice and not obeying Jehovah's commandment, which has been given through his representative Samuel, to wait for Samuel to offer up the sacrifice. Compare 1 Samuel 10:8. As a consequence of this act, Saul's kingdom was not to last. 1 Samuel 13. 1-14. In the progress of the campaign against the Philistines, Saul pronounced a curse upon anyone partaking of food before vengeance was executed on the enemy. This rash oath led to adverse consequences. The Israelites tired, and though they triumphed over the Philistines, their victory was not as great as it might have been. Famished, they did not take time to drain the blood from the animals they afterwards slaughtered, thereby violating God's law concerning the sanctity of blood. Not having heard his father's oath, Jonathan ate some honey. Saul, therefore, pronounced the death sentence upon him. But the people redeemed Jonathan, o textoi acute miritra longo. Saul 872 terrorized him. Having withdrawn his spirit from Saul, Jehovah made it possible for a bad spirit to gain possession of him, depriving Saul of his peace of mind and stirring up his feelings, thoughts, and imaginations in a wrong way. Saul's failure to obey Jehovah indicated a bad inclination of mind and heart, against which God's Spirit offered Saul no protection or resistive force. However, since Jehovah had permitted the bad spirit to replace his spirit and terrorize Saul, it could be termed a bad spirit from Jehovah, so that Saul's servants spoke of it as God's bad spirit. On the recommendation of one of his attendants, Saul requested that David be his court musician to calm him when he was troubled by the bad spirit. 1 Samuel 16. 14-23. 17. 15. Relationships with David. Thereafter the Philistines threatened Israel's security. While they were camped on one side of the lower plain of Elah and King Saul's forces were camped on the opposite side, Goliath, morning and evening, for 40 days, emerged from the Philistine camp, challenging Israel to furnish a man to fight him in single combat. King Saul promised to enrich and to form a marriage alliance with any Israelite who might strike down Goliath. Also, the house of the victor's father was to be set free, probably from the payment of taxes and compulsory service. Compare 1 Samuel 8:11-17. When David arrived on the scene with food or supplies for his brothers and certain portions for the chief of the 1,000, possibly the commander under whom David's brothers served, his questionings apparently suggested his willingness to answer the challenge. This led to his being brought to Saul and to his subsequent victory over Goliath. 1 Samuel 17. 1-58. Develops enmity for David. Saul thereafter placed David over the men of war. This eventually resulted in David's being celebrated in song more than the king himself. Saul, therefore, came to view David with suspicion and envious hatred. On one occasion, as David was playing on the harp, Saul began behaving like a prophet. Not that Saul began to utter prophecies, but he evidently manifested extraordinary feeling and a physical disturbance like that of a prophet just prior to prophesying or when prophesying. While in that unusual, disturbed state, Saul twice hurled a spear at David. Failing in his attempts to pin David to the wall, Saul later agreed to give his daughter Michal in marriage to David upon the presentation of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Saul's intent in making this offer was that David would die at their hands. The scheme failed, David presenting, not 100, but 200 foreskins to form a marriage alliance with Saul. The king's fear of and hatred for David therefore intensified. To his son Jonathan and to all of his servants, Saul spoke about his desire to put David to death.